cruel, inhumane and degrading, a damning indictment of how the US used torture as an everyday weapon in secret CIA prisons around the world. But what did it achieve, and who should be held responsible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. A long-awaited report into so-called enhanced interrogation techniques at CIA black sites around the world has painted a bleak picture of US torture and abuse. Described as a stain on US values and history, it talks of brutalizing scores of so-called terror suspects under President George W. Bush. But the report concludes none of it proved to be an effective means of acquiring useful intelligence. The Senate Intelligence Committee spent 5 years analyzing more than 6 million pages of CIA documents detailing tactics used after the September 11th attacks in 2001. A 525-page summary paints a picture of the CIA as an agency gone rogue. It accuses the CIA of using interrogation techniques far harsher than were widely known, subjecting suspects to beatings, simulated drowning and sleep deprivation, and threatening to harm, kill or sexually abuse their families. The report said the CIA misled the White House, Congress and other agencies to maintain a program that had little oversight. And overall, information obtained from suspects did nothing to make the United States a safer place. Patty Culhane in Washington has this report.
Hundreds of pages of details and evidence of what happened to 119 men detained by the Central Intelligence Agency in secret prisons, like this one in Lithuania.
The CIA program was far more brutal than people were led to believe.
Detainees were deprived of sleep for up to 180 hours, more than a week. 5 were forced to have enemas, not for medical reasons. The report says it's likely more than 3 people were waterboarded, which the CIA itself described as a series of near drownings. And there are numerous reports of physical, violent beatings, contradicting past reassurances from top CIA bosses.
All right, this is your last chance.
The Senate report says the CIA purposefully lied to Congress, the White House, the public. Crucially, they say, they lied about the program's effectiveness.
I can say that questioning the detainees in this program has given us information that has saved innocent lives by helping us stop new attacks.
The report says that's not true. The interrogations did not stop plots or lead to the capture or killing of any al-Qaeda operatives, like Osama bin Laden or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. U.S. President Barack Obama has banned the use of torture, but has ruled out prosecuting the people who carried it out.
My goal is to make sure, having banned this practice as one of the first things I did when I came into office, that we don't make that mistake again. But we have to recognize that when we are under threat and we're afraid, and the public is clamoring to do something, that's when we have to be most on guard, because there are times where we can slip into the kinds of activities that I don't think we want to see repeated.
And experts warn the next president could overturn his order.
It would unfortunately be pretty easy for President Obama or the next president to ignore executive actions that have been taken on torture, because we've seen a huge expansion of executive authority under Presidents Bush and Obama.
The CIA is refuting the report, denying the allegations, and the Republicans who will control the Senate soon seem to be backing them up.
The executive summary and findings and conclusions released today contain a disturbing number of factual and analytical errors.
It seems unlikely Congress will push for more details, hearings, or hold people to account. That means the world might have a better idea of what happened to the men before they were sent to Guantanamo Bay prison, but no one but them will pay a price for how they were treated. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guests now for this inside story from Washington, D.C. Robert Grenier, former director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Joining us from London is Clare Algar, executive director of the human rights NGO Reprieve. And completing our panel in Birmingham is Moazzam Begg, outreach director of the rights group Cage Prisoners, and who spent nearly 3 years detained in Guantanamo Bay. Thank you all for being with us on Inside Story. Robert Grenier, let me start with you. Pretty damning report this on an organization that you served in for many years. Your initial thoughts?
Well, look, this is a very, very complicated topic, and I'm hoping that we can have a useful discussion on this. You know, as you might imagine, I see a lot of problems with this report. In point of fact, what the Republicans who have issued their own report have said is true in many respects. With regard to whether or not these techniques were effective in acquiring intelligence, and I hasten to add that when we're talking about a moral issue here, questions of efficacy probably shouldn't be involved at all, but that's a primary part of this Senate Democratic report. They're saying that not only were these techniques wrong, but they're saying they were also ineffective. Well, I can tell you that with regard to the effectiveness part, they were highly effective. We all know what happened on 9/11. We are aware of what members of al-Qaeda were trying to do in order to reprise those attacks. Up until now, at least with regard to the United States, they have not been successful. They managed to kill a lot of other people in a lot of other countries. They haven't been able to reprise their attacks on the United States. And so somebody somewhere did something right, at least as far as stopping these attacks were concerned. Please understand correctly, I regard this Senate Democratic report as a very effective piece of propaganda. And I mean that in this sense. What they have done is to paint, frankly, a rather cartoonish picture. Many people might regard their intentions as being praiseworthy. I think that Dianne Feinstein, the current chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, wants to make sure that these practices are never employed again. And so what she has done is she has put together a report which is a good deal clearer and more compelling than the truth in order to bring that about. So we may feel positively about her aims here, but the methods that she is using are highly disingenuous and at the end of the day may harm her cause badly.
But nevertheless, Robert Grenier, there are some pretty damning accounts in this report, what is a summary of a larger report. And you bring up 9/11. I'm sure no one doubts the brutality of what happened on that day. But many people listening to what you've said there will say that it implies that you're justifying some of the things that were done to prisoners, some of the things that are detailed in this report, such as waterboarding, sleep deprivation, starvation, and so on.
Well, let's make a real distinction here. There were certain interrogation techniques that were enumerated, that were authorized by the highest levels of the U.S. government, and more particularly, they were authorized by the senior officials in the U.S. Department of Justice, whose job it is to make interpretations as to what is legal and what is not under international law. One of the things that we really ought to get into is that the whole issue, one of the difficulties here, is that the International Convention on Torture, which is what the law that applies here, is maddeningly inspecific. Essentially what it says, I mean, I could quote the language to you, but essentially what it says is thou shalt not torture. And that leaves room for all sorts of interpretation. And at the end of the day, people can come out with very different conclusions as to what ought to be permitted and what ought not. Now, there were other things that were done in these CIA black sites that clearly exceeded what was allowed. Those were isolated incidents, but nonetheless, in some cases, they occurred, and the perpetrators were actually punished, either administratively, if they didn't reach the level of a criminal offense, and in some cases they were punished under criminal statutes. But this report conflates the two. It says that yes, there were all these authorized things to do, and that CIA did. They were authorized to do them, and that they were very, very bad. And look, they did these other things as well, and somehow they conflate the two as though it was all sort of one unvariegated mass of criminal activity. So we really need to take a look at this very, very carefully and have an honest discussion about what actually happened here and what we really ought to think about it.
Moazzam Begg, much of what's contained in this report isn't going to surprise a lot of people, least of all yourself, I suspect. What do you take from it?
Well, of course, we, the former prisoners, the lawyers, even former guards and interrogators have been saying this for the past 13 odd years, that torture has taken place, people have been raped, people have been brutalized, people have been subjected to sounds of women screaming next door that they're led to believe that their wives and their children, which is what happened to me. But more importantly, just to respond to your guest, is that he's correct in saying that it was from the highest levels of government where this authorization came. And people like Alberto Gonzales and Jay Bybee, who argued, who were the most senior legal advisors to the Bush administration, said that for something to constitute torture, it must include organ failure or death. Otherwise, it's not torture. Of course, that's going to be interpreted on the ground as a no-holds-barred operation in terms of what torture means. But here's one example, one stark example, waterboarding. It was first used during the Spanish Inquisition. It's called in Spanish tortura del agua, torture of the water. And American soldiers who were waterboarded by the Japanese during World War II, those Japanese soldiers were prosecuted for war crimes successfully. And yet how could it be that we could say in 2000 whenever it happened in the past 10 years that this is no longer torture? It doesn't make any sense. And so what we've got is a reinterpretation of torture. And what's missing in the story of all of this is that what does this do? And when does torture become justified? Because torture is a crime. False imprisonment is a crime. Kidnap is a crime. If I was to do it to somebody in a normal situation here, I would be prosecuted. How could it be that the President of the United States of America, the first thing that he says after that he said that torture will be stopped, is that those who were involved in this torture, in this crime, will be immune to prosecution? Those agents who conveniently destroyed the tapes of waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah, for example, were never brought to book. So that, in a sense, is an evidence of torture being done, a crime being done, the evidence being destroyed, and then nobody being brought to book. It is completely outrageous that after this torture inquiry has been made public, which I'd have to applaud the Americans at least for doing that people would come around and try to justify it. It's a time to look back at that and say, we were wrong, apologize, and because it's a crime, people are afraid of prosecutions. They would never allow, for example, if they catch the counterterrorism suspect and said, okay, as long as you say you'll never do it again, we'll let you go. They would never do that.
Clare Algar, I know you want to respond to some of what you've just heard there, but I want to ask you as well, what lessons do you think should be learned from all this?
I will come back and respond to some of that, but in answer to your question, I mean, I feel that this report is a positive thing, and I think that the Americans should be commended for having undertaken the work. I know that it took an incredibly long time. It was an extraordinarily painstaking process, and I think it's a step on the road to transparency. It's not accountability. You know, as you've said, as Moazzam said, we're not looking at prosecutions in the US here, but at least it sets some information out, and that in and of itself is very powerful. You know, if someone were to read pages 40 to 46 of the summary report, which details what happened to Abu Zubaydah, it's incredibly powerful stuff. It talks about an interrogator who snaps his finger and Abu Zubaydah walks over and lies down on the waterboarding thing. You know, and it also then details the effect that the ongoing torture, so he is tortured for 19 days, 24 hours a day, which I wouldn't have thought was possible, but seemed to take place. And it also, it notes the effect that it has on the CIA agents who you know, by day 4 are starting to feel uncomfortable. By day 5, it's talking about them welling up with tears. By day 7, it's talking about them, you know, possibly electing to transfer. Those sorts of details, you know, there are obviously going to be questions all over the place about, you know, is it correct that, you know, where did the authority come from? How high up the chain did it go? You know, do the Republicans accept this? Does it have enough in it? Which is what I'm going to come to in a minute. But you know, simply setting out those simple stories and what happened to him. And in terms of organ failure and death, it talked about several times when he was being waterboarded, when he became unresponsive and bubbles of air were seen coming up through the water in his mouth, and he then had to be resuscitated. And so, you know, I think that one of the very positive things about the report also is that Dianne Feinstein says in the foreword, you know, in any common language this is torture. And, you know, once and for all, that chapter, you know, we can perhaps stop having this conversation about the definition of torture, because it seems to be accepted that this stuff did amount to torture.
Well, sure.
In terms of what it didn't, I mean, just in terms of what, what one learns from it, I think one can say that there are other countries who should look at doing this. There's a case that Reprieve is bringing where it's very clear that it was a CIA operation and MI6 was up to its neck in it. And David Cameron promised when he became Prime Minister that there would be an independent judge-led inquiry into the British intelligence services part in the rendition programme, and that has not happened. It has been abandoned, and in fact it's been handed over to the committee which was supposed to be overseeing the British intelligence services when this stuff happened, and failed to spot it. So definitely there are lessons in there for the rest of the world.
Let's talk more then about where much of this is reported to have taken place. The black sites that were mentioned earlier. US President George W. Bush empowered the CIA to detain and interrogate prisoners at secret locations around the world following the 9/11 attacks. This latest report helps identify where these so-called CIA black sites were. Now, as you can see here, it shows the CIA was operating secret prisons in Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Afghanistan, and Thailand. There's also evidence to suggest prisons in countries such as Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco, and Algeria were used, although not controlled by the CIA. So we just showed there some of the places where this is reported to have taken place. And it shows, Moazzam Begg, that a number of countries were complicit in all of this, and it wasn't just the US by itself.
Absolutely. Of course, the US couldn't have done this by itself. It needed places to outsource the torture to. When I was held in the Bagram detention facility, I was told very clearly by the CIA that if I didn't cooperate, I'd either be sent to Egypt or to Syria. And I know that individuals were sent to both countries. One of the most important cases that I've looked at in recent times was the case of a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was a Libyan man said to be the most senior ranking member of al-Qaeda, captured at that point to date in 2002. The same agents who interrogated him interrogated me, and they said that he was seated on the same chair that I was, and they said that he didn't cooperate, so they sent him to Egypt. Now in Egypt I learned later that he'd given a confession under torture that he was an al-Qaeda working with Saddam Hussein on obtaining weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell, who was the State Secretary at the time, took that statement to the UN Secretary and to the United Nations Security Council to argue for a case of war in Iraq. Now we can see, based on this tortured testimony, we invaded a country, and you can see what's happened in Iraq as a result, that the Al-Qaeda organization rose there as a result of that. Islamic State in Iraq rose, and as a result of that, you've got Islamic State that's there now. So these organizations have been born out of torture. So that's just one example of what happens when you outsource it, when you rely on uncredible information, when information is completely unreliable, and you action it, and then you have to lie continually to maintain your position, because you can't turn around and say, sorry, we got it wrong, we just invaded a country based on torture evidence. The other cases you can talk about is as Claire mentioned, we gave a whole series of cases of people that have been tortured across the world with the complicity of the British government. And unlike the Americans in this case, I would say this much, is that at least the Americans have come forward and have been honest about what's happened. Britain hasn't done this yet. It's talked about wanting to put this matter to rest, but it hasn't. And in fact, what you see is a precedent that's been set for countries around the world. You can see Egypt, countries like Syria and others, when they say now they have a war against terror also, you can see how journalists, if they are regarded as against the government, will be charged with terrorism crimes and imprisoned. And you can see how, for example, in Syria, the same sort of thing will happen, and all sorts of brutalities then become justified in the name of national security. And this is what happened right across the Arab world, and in fact people rose up against it.
All right, I want to put some of this back to Robert Grenier. I mean, you talked earlier about the effectiveness, what you believe is the effectiveness of some of these methods and what the information that it's led to. But when someone is being tortured, especially some of the things that they were being subjected to that we outlined a little bit earlier, there are questions about just how effective the information is, just how reliable the information is that they're giving. As Moazzam said there, I mean, John McCain, U.S. Senator John McCain, has been very vocal on this, and he is someone who has been through this himself. He was, of course, a POW in Vietnam, and he was subjected to several beatings. And he ended up giving names that were completely false because he just wanted the pain to stop. I mean, this is the trouble with what you refer to as enhanced interrogation, what some people simply call torture, is the reliability of the information that they are giving, because they just want it to stop.
This is a very complicated subject, and it's largely misunderstood. Let's see if we can pick at this a little bit. You know, I think the popular conception of torture, sort of the classic case, if you will, is one where you have police or intelligence agents or whoever who are interrogating an individual, and they want a certain answer. We think of this more in, if you will, a law enforcement context, that really what they want is they want the confession, they want the admission. And once they've gotten that, then their work is done. That was the case with John McCain when he was being held by the North Vietnamese. John McCain didn't have any information that was of any interest to them. They wanted him to confess to the fact that the U.S. was engaged in war crimes in South Vietnam. And to him, it was a matter of honor to resist that. And when he broke down and acceded to their desires, that greatly informed his view of torture. And he clearly was tortured. Now, you may not have a positive view of harsh interrogation, torture for intelligence purposes, but actually it's quite different, at least in terms of the aims. If an individual is being questioned for intelligence purposes, and that individual makes certain admissions, and he gives up the names of colleagues, for instance, that's not the end of the process, that's the beginning of the process. You don't know initially whether that information is of any value or not.
The pieces in a larger jigsaw,
to other investigations. And I'm sorry, exactly. And at the end of the day, that has to be corroborated in order for it to be deemed of any value whatsoever. So in the hands of an effective interrogator who actually knows what he is about, certain measured means of pressure can be very, very effective in helping him to do his job. Now, we can argue about what measures are justified or not. Now, if an individual wants to go to sleep in the middle of an interrogation, the interrogator says no, most of us would probably say, well, that's not torture. But if he's kept up and denied sleep for 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours, at some point, we would all agree that that's certainly verging on torture, if not actual torture. The point is that there need to be red lines. Now, I don't expect that anybody is going to have a great deal of sympathy for the CIA, but whether it's the CIA, whether it is a legitimate intelligence and security service serving another country overseas, there are people who are ideologically motivated to commit mass murder, and something has to be done to stop them. Now, I'm not saying that anything has to be done to stop them. There really have to be clear rules. The point is to come up with clear rules that conform to international law, such as it is. And I think really we need to start with the international law. I think it needs to be much more specific than it is.
All right. I know Clare Algar wants to respond to some of this. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, the problem is that if one looks at the report and one specifically, again, looks at this case of Abu Zubaydah, initially he was considered to be number 3 or 4 in Al-Qaeda. He was subjected to really appalling torture, and I don't think that there can be any question as to that. And indeed, one of the things that I found quite disturbing in terms of the kind of up-the-line authorization thing is that the CIA agents involved sent a message up the line saying, we think that we're approaching what's not legal here. And the thing that came back down the line is it's incredibly unhelpful to put any of that in writing. Please don't do it again, which I think is worrying. But also, at the end of all of that, it was decided that he wasn't actually a member of Al-Qaeda, and that no useful information had been gotten out of him. And yet, and this is the problematic bit, the procedure was still deemed to be appropriate and indeed used as a precedent for future HVDs because it had shown that the guy didn't actually know what it was the CIA had thought he knew. And that, I think, is completely unacceptable on any view. All
right, that is going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all three of our guests, Robert Grenier in Washington, Clare Algar in London, and joining us from Birmingham, Moazzam Begg. Thank you very much, all three of you. And a reminder, you can find this show and many more on our website. That's aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. You can also leave a comment there. Or you can also add to the discussion on Facebook. Just add /AJ Inside Story. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.